How is it?
Hey everyone, this is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explored.org. Please stand by. In less than a minute, at the top of the hour, Ranger Naomi from Katmai National Park and myself will be hosting a live play-by-play to talk about the bear and salmon activity that we see on the webcams at Brooks River. So I'm glad you're joining us tonight. Again, we'll be with you in just about 30 seconds or so. Well, hello everyone, no matter where you happen to be around the world. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explored.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And welcome to this latest play-by-play broadcast brought to you by Explored.org and the National Park Service. It's August 17th, 2020. And tonight, as usual, I'm joined by Ranger Naomi Boak from Katmai National Park to help explore salmon activity that we see on the river today. And as always, Naomi, it's great to speak with you again.
Oh yeah, always fun to be here doing these play-by-plays. And it's August and we're still seeing bears.
Right, that's a recurring theme in these broadcasts over the past couple of weeks or so. We'll maybe talk, of course, about that as we dive into things. If you've never joined us for these broadcasts before, this is a live footage of Brooks River in Katmai National Park. I'm not physically at Brooks River. I'm actually on the East Coast looking at the webcams. Naomi is at Brooks River, but she's inside, so she's not able to really directly see the river, but she has a lot of firsthand knowledge of what's going on there this summer. So we're going to tag team what we see on the webcams and try to lend some our insight and hopefully give you a better understanding of the ecology of the bears, the behavior of the bears, and of course the salmon that we see. We have several different views available to us today, so we're not only going to be focusing at Brooks Falls, but we'll be going to different cameras from time to time, depending on the activity. And we also have a couple of wonderful camera operators that are helping us to find bears, and they're driving the cameras, letting us know what they see. What they see through the camera controls is about 30 seconds ahead of what Naomi and I can see. So they can give us a little bit of a heads up if something exciting happens along the river. But
can't say too many good things about, go ahead. I was gonna say you can't say too many good things about camera operators. They're amazing.
Right. They are in many ways the unsung heroes of the Bear Cam and the Explore.org experience. So if you enjoy any of the views on Explore.org, you probably have a camera operator working behind the scenes to curate that experience for you. So thank a camera operator as much as you can. Let's introduce the Brooks River location, though, and our camera location to our audience. Brooks River is located about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska, in the west central portion of Katmai National Park. And the river is about 1.5 miles long, but it's bisected by Brooks Falls. And along with our webcam partner, the National Park Service, Explore.org hosts and maintains several webcams at Brooks River. The signal from those webcams is relayed wirelessly to 2 radio repeaters on Dumpling Mountain. And then those repeaters also send the signal wirelessly to the small town of King Salmon, about 30 miles away, where it gets uploaded to the rest of the internet. Back at Brooks River, this is just a map of the lower half of Brooks River, offering us the chance to see which cameras are where. We'll be focusing a lot on the Brooks Falls cam on the left side of the screen and the Riffles camera tonight, just about 100 yards downstream of the falls. So we'll have a really good view of the area downstream of the falls from time to time. So this is the line of sight for Brooks Falls. This is the line of sight that we'll have for the Riffles. And then we'll also go downstream because we'll see different bears doing different things at near the mouth of Brooks River. So we'll be going to the River Watch, and this is that area outlined in blue is the River Watch line of sight. Naomi and I also have several questions that we're going to try to answer during the broadcast, depending on what we happen to see. Those questions were submitted in advance through the Ask Your Bear Cam question form. You can find a link to that in the featured comment at the bottom of the page. But with all that being said, let's head back up to the falls, Naomi. And since you've been, you just got off your weekend, you did a lot of bear watching this weekend. Can you give us a brief rundown of the general bear activity that we've seen at that you've seen at the river over the past couple of days?
Yeah, well, at the falls, there were some of the usual suspects. 151 was there. I tend to go early in the morning and in the evening to the falls. And 747 was hanging out, being very patient in the jacuzzi. And they were not catching a lot of fish, but they were certainly catching fish. And on the lower river, Bear 273, who has 3 yearling cubs, was keeping us entertained for quite some time. And it made me remember last time she had a cub, and it was a single cub that is now Bear 809. And that summer, they were some of the only bears here in August, and they certainly kept us entertained for the month of August. They were all over the place. She played a lot with that cub. She was playing a lot with her 3 cubs as well this weekend. So, and there on the lower river, you see some playful cubs.
Yeah, we were talking earlier today, Naomi, about how the bears have time on their hands, time on their paws, I guess would be more accurately speaking, and lots of food available to them still, so they can express a lot of these behaviors that aren't maybe pure survival behaviors. This living at Brooks River is no game for them. Certainly, this is they come here to survive. They come here to gain access to the food resources, the salmon they need to survive. But there's so much food available in the system this year that they can really expend extra energy playing with one another. We're seeing not only young bears play like this pair right here, but we're seeing sometimes even older adult males partake in a little bit of play, and sometimes even females with cubs, which is extremely rare. Right? Until this year, I don't think I've ever seen a female who's caring for cubs play with a bear that's not part of her own family. So a lot of unique things happening on the river this year.
And also something else that I saw was intermingling of family, which that doesn't happen when there's not enough salmon.
Very true. You know, the amount of fish available has given bears again chances to do things that they might not have the chance to do in a quote unquote normal year when we have a normal amount of salmon moving into Brooks River. Brooks River gets about 20% of the salmon escapement from Naknek River. And Naomi, I'm going to show everyone a quick map here of the journey that salmon take to get to Brooks River. So there's a lot of fish that are dispersing throughout the watershed right now, becoming available in a lot of different portions. But for all the salmon that go through Naknek River, that squiggly line sort of on the left side of the screen and go into Naknek Lake, about 20% of those will go through Brooks River, and thousands of them will spawn in Brooks River, and a lot of them will go into Lake Brooks. And with the escapement, over 4 million fish for Naknek River. And honestly, that could be the largest salmon escapement for any river on Earth this year. Just to give you some perspective on that, for every million fish, there was probably 200,000 that came through Brooks River.
It's been phenomenal to see wall-to-wall salmon, and that's changing a bit now. We see fewer salmon in the lower river, but I did want to comment one thing about the intermingling that I saw yesterday, and I think something else that's happened with so many salmon and the bears and the whole ecosystem being so healthy was that cubs seemed to be learning more this summer, and seemingly more independent. Even spring cubs we've seen, but 273's cubs on their own went and initiated play with subadults yesterday in the lower river, and that seemed extraordinary. And I think part of that they do have time, and their behavior is maturing in a way that we don't normally.
Yeah, they're socializing a lot with strange bears. With family groups, with in years where there's less food, they're less likely to interact in a friendly manner with strange bears. But they have that opportunity this year. Bears, I think they feel things like we feel things. What goes on their brain isn't exactly the same as ours, but they do have feelings. So I would imagine that when their stomach empty, then they definitely they don't feel their own form of hangriness or crankiness, and there's far less of that this year. And these couple of young bears that we're watching playing right now are just an example of that. If this was an ecosystem or a time of the year when food was much more scarce and bears were feeling those strong hunger pangs, then we might not see them express play nearly as much.
Now that is not a small bear.
No, transitioning back up to the falls. And this is, we're looking at a couple of young independent bears downstream that were play fighting. And now, of course, this bear is quite a sizable animal. This is an adult male. And in the far pool, that's a preferred fishing spot for a lot of these big guys because they can just sit and wait for salmon to come to them. And while the salmon migration for sockeye in this area is really kind of over right now, the sockeye are just kind of figuring out the right places to spawn. But they're pretty much at the right area. They just want to find the side. So bears are still kind of looking for some of those fresher sockeye moving up to the falls, but also there's another run of salmon, Naomi, coming into the river right now, and that happens to be the silver or coho salmon. They're far less numerous than sockeye salmon, but I've heard some reports, and I've seen some bears catching fish at the falls that look like they could be big enough for silver salmon. Have you had the opportunity to see any, maybe from the bridge as you've been walking, or maybe at the falls when you've been watching bears there?
Yeah, Lower River seeing a few, but not a lot.
Okay.
I mean, it's still mostly sockeye, and a lot fewer salmon in the lower river. Even from a few days ago, when you could see this, these dark waves in the lower river, which are just filled with sockeye, and those waves are smaller right now.
The salmon are really, again, trying to figure out the best place to spawn for them. Many salmon won't spawn in the river until, well, until mid-October. A few of them will delay their spawning until then. When you do get an opportunity to see the difference between a sockeye and a silver salmon, the sockeye are quickly transitioning into their spawning colors. So they're going to have bright red backs, green heads, really just kind of gorgeous fish. And this is footage from the Upper Brooks River, some underwater footage I took of salmon a few years ago. The silver salmon are going to look a little bit different in their spawning colors. When they first arrive and when we start to see bears first catching them at the Brooks Falls, they're going to look pretty silvery. And another name for these fish is coho. So different areas of North America, they're called coho. But instead of having a red back, they kind of have an olive green back and they have reddish sides. They're also larger than the sockeye on average. The sockeye might be 4 to 8 pounds, anywhere in between there. And the coho salmon are going to average larger than that. So at least probably 8 pounds, maybe upwards of 12 or 15 pounds for some of those larger coho salmon in this area. Up at the falls, Naomi, this looks like a chunk right here, just to give our viewers an ID on this bear.
Yes, I think it is chunk. You'll notice he has a kind of light bulb shaped body, bigger at the back end, and a kind of distinctive head. And he is one of our biggest bears. So I have a question, Mike, about silver salmon versus sockeye salmon. Do they travel in different waters than the sockeye salmon?
Well, in the ocean, they're going to intermingle with populations of sockeye, but the silver salmon feed on different things in the sea. They actually spend about the same amount of time in the ocean as sockeye do, so 2 to 3 years. But they feed more often on fish than sockeye. Sockeye tend to feed on things like krill and other small crustaceans in the ocean. But silver salmon, they end up feeding a lot more on fish. So they grow larger, but they do intermingle out in the ocean. And then when they come back into fresh water, there's definitely overlap in their spawning habitats that they happen to prefer.
So I'm going to take a guess that is bear 812 in the jacuzzi. You think, Mike?
Yeah, I think so. 812 is a young adult. He's growing quite rapidly. He's already a big guy for his age. He was born in 2015, so he's quite big for his age. And learning to fish the jacuzzi, he's very skilled on the lip of the falls, but he's getting big enough to hold his ground in the jacuzzi, establish his presence there. He still yields to a lot of the larger bears in the area. He's not quite that big, but he's definitely a big guy overall. We were watching him fish. At the beginning of the broadcast, he was the bear that was catching a fish up on the lip of the falls. And now he's really deep in the jacuzzi. We don't see bears going that very far in the jacuzzi. He's probably was standing actually on his hind legs when he moved closer to the waterfall there. It's quite deep. Once he moves beyond, if he moves any further beyond where he is, there's a very steep drop off in there. And the jacuzzi right in front of that bear's face, that's the deepest spot below Brooks Falls.
And I know I do this frequently, and I think Mike does it not as frequently, but I often confuse bear 812 with bear 503. They're both offspring of bear 402. They look so much alike. Bear 503 is larger, but 812 has really grown this year, And he also has one behavior that 503 doesn't have, which is that when he fishes on the lip, he brings his catch back to a rock, which he uses as a dinner table. So you can pretty much tell that that's bear 812 when he has his dinner on the dinner table back there.
Yes, he's very civilized in that way. He will use a table, and most bears are just gonna eat it wherever they can. And 812, again, yeah, he does look an awful lot like 503. They both, to me, they both have their and mother's ears. They both have sort of like apostrophe or crescent-shaped ears when you're looking at their faces straight on. And Naomi, we've talked a lot about individual bears so far in this broadcast, but we haven't really told people where they can find more information about those bears. So where's the best place for people to go to find information about these individual animals?
Well, there is a PDF book called The Bears of Brooks River, and we try to do them every year. This year, for numerous reasons, including the pandemic. This year's book is still being worked on, but there is a link on the Explore Bear Cam site, as well as Katmai National Park's website, where you can get that. And it's not comprehensive. It doesn't have every single bear in it, but the bears we see most often and that are most popular, they've got life stories. These bears have very interesting life stories if you continue to watch them over the years. Like I talked about Bear 273 before. She habituates here in August and is a delight to watch.
We have a couple of different bears in our view right now that are waiting patiently for fish. And the one that's sort of the darker one that's walking in the foreground, to me, that looks like that could be number 821. If it gets out of the water and we see a big scar on his right hip, sure. So scars are one of those identifying features, one of those identifying characteristics that you look for. They can be ephemeral. So from year to year, they change. So when I'm identifying a bear, I often look at the gestalt of the bear, the whole package, really. Not only its physical characteristics, but its behavior. And these two bears that are playing right now, both 812 and 821. I'm going to try not to get confused or confuse the audience with those numbers tonight, Naomi. But these two bears are very tolerant of one another. We often see them playing and fishing right next to one another in this vicinity.
Also, when you showed the map of the Boak River, people wonder sometimes how long it takes a bear to get from the lower river to the falls, and it's not very long at all, because just a little while ago I saw bear 821 down in the lower river, and it was an easy walk for him to go from the lower river to Brooks Falls.
Yeah, it doesn't take them very long when they're motivated. They could easily make that trek up the river in just a matter of a few minutes. It's the distance from the cameras that we have at the lower river and the cameras at the falls, really by the water flowing, it may be 3/4 of a mile at most, probably less than that. So they could easily make that trip in a short period of time. But another example of a play fight here, Naomi, really good look at it. Good lighting on the river at this time of the day and on the bears with the sun behind the camera. Jawing with one another. This is like movement that mimics a real fight, but you can see that they're not really actually engaging in a fight. They're not latching on and twisting really violently compared to a real fight. But a lot of these movements, they tend to mimic a real fight.
Yeah, I mean that kind of mimics a real fight, but it's playful.
And bears, when they're doing this, they're showing a lot of restraint. I mean, they possess the ability to significantly inflict injury on each other. So in these situations, and even in an encounter where that's not friendly, family, they almost always practice a great deal of restraint, because they're not only, you know, they are risking their own physical health if they get too violent with another bear. So they try to avoid those conflicts as much as they can. But yeah, real good look at these bears standing up on their hind legs. Hard to tell just how big they are, but I would not doubt if both of these bears are between, if, 5 or 6 feet high, probably closer to 6 feet tall while they're standing up on their hind legs here. But a really good example of a vigorous play fight and sparring going on.
Always fun to watch. And Bear 32 Chunk, who we saw earlier, when he was younger, and really till maybe he was 10 or 12, he liked to play fight a lot too. He and Bear 89 Backpack would play for what seemed for hours to me, and they were both pretty big bears at that point.
Definitely, a couple of bears with extra energy to expend have caught several fish today. Each one of these fish has several thousand calories in them, so when they're eating the whole thing, they can easily meet their daily energetic needs and gain the body mass and fat that allows them to survive winter hibernation. We'll maybe pan away from these bears and come back to them as they continue to wrestle downstream of the falls. We'll take just a look at the riffles here. I think for a second, we haven't gone to this view yet during the broadcast. The bears that are playing are on the extreme left side of the screen. And then we have, again, a couple of those other bears towards the far pool. There's one downstream of the rocks, that's number 480 Otis, and then 32 Chunk, who's in the far pool. And then downstream at the river mouth, on our River Watch camera, a great view of some sockeye salmon that are staging in this area. And since I'm not at the river right now, Naomi, this is one of the scenes that I actually miss the most. Standing on the platform at the mouth of Brooks River in late summer and watching the fish in the water.
I love to do that too. I was doing that this afternoon, and watching them stage, and then you see some rainbow trout in amongst them. They'll kind of be a little bit separate from most of the sockeye, and they really are turning red right now. It's hard to see in this video picture, but there are many more red sockeye here. There's one you can see is very red and has that green mouth.
Yeah, that bright spawning colors, those bright red bodies, green heads, humped back, hooked jaws, those are signs for other salmon that says basically, hey, I'm ready to go, ready to spawn. And salmon really don't attain those spawning colors until they're pretty close to their spawning site and the time when they're ready to spawn. So some of these fish could have arrived in Brooks River back in July. Most of them probably did arrive in July, and they've just been holding steady in the river, waiting for the right time to spawn. For some of these fish, it's going to be maybe in just a few days. For some of them, again, like I said before, it won't be until October. So for some of the fish, the transition from those sleek and silvery animals that we see at the beginning of the salmon run into the red-bodied animals takes a long time. But it's really not until they attain those bright spawning colors that they're fully mature adults. A lot of the fish still in the river right now haven't achieved that level of maturity. So that transition is still taking place within them. But just a great look right now of some of those salmon getting ready to move upriver. This is a spot, Naomi, where we don't see a lot of spawning activity happening. You might see a little bit of salmon turning on their side and kind of fanning the gravel, but no real serious nest digging happening in this area. When you were when you came to the river earlier this year, Naomi, back in May, in June, did you see this much water in this area?
The water's been very low this year. I mean, for the whole summer, and it's quite warm here today. It's been in the 70s here, which is not typical weather for Brooks Camp, although last year it was mostly like this. But we've had a very warm week. The other thing on the lower river that I've noticed, of course, it's getting to look a lot more like August, and we've had fewer bears there. And also noticing they're eating the whole salmon right now because they're not getting, there aren't so many salmon. And earlier in the season in July, when there were so many salmon, the bears would just eat the fattiest parts, the brains, the skin, and if they had a female, the eggs. But on the lower river, it's interesting for me because you can hear the crunch on the bones when they're eating the whole salmon down here, which you really don't hear at the falls because of the noise of the falls. But I know a lot of people ask, what does Brooks feel like and smell like, and what does it sound like? And that's one of the sounds right now on the lower river. You hear, the crunching of salmon bones when they're eating a whole salmon. And there we have is that a Merganser duck?
Yeah, it looked like a merganser that was diving and then popped up right next to those salmon and spooked a few of them. And the reason, Naomi, that I asked earlier about the fish and the water levels is because it's not uncommon really to have very low water conditions at Brooks River earlier in the season, and as the snow melts, rain falls throughout the summer, there's more glacial melt from the glaciers on the volcanoes, the basin sort of fills up, the Naknek Lake Basin. So we see a lot of that water that water level increase in the lower river, just reflecting the level of the lake downstream of where these fish are. The sockeye, they seem to know, however, that once things start to freeze up, the water level in Naknek Lake is going to drop quite a bit, and that's going to expose a lot of this gravel that they're at right now. So for to judge that, the water conditions and move into areas where the river flow throughout the wintertime is going to be more consistent and provide their opportunity to stay protected away from areas that might be exposed and to freezing temperatures, for instance. And it's going to be very soon where we can see a lot of salmon spawning from this view, looking upstream from the riffles towards Brooks Falls. All those, that area downstream of Brooks Falls to the riffles, and even a couple hundred yards downstream of that is just prime sockeye spawning conditions. It's really perfect habitat for them to spawn.
And those bears were still play fighting.
Yeah, that play fight was pretty extended as we were talking about salmon. They've brought up a little bit. Maybe the darker one, 8-2-1, is not quite done yet, so he might join his sparring partner in the jacuzzi here. With the big adult males that we see like Otis and Chunk sitting there patiently on the far side, really wouldn't see that level of camaraderie, so to speak. But with them, they are much more loners. Although again, like we've said this year, there's a lot of food available to them, so they're more tolerant of other bears. But certainly, adult males are less likely to play. Older adult males, I should say, are less likely to play than those younger adult males and older subadults that they were just looking at. And I think right now we're taking perhaps our first really good look at one of the river's most famous bears, number 480 Otis.
Fame and patient.
Yeah, one of our most patient bears. He is a master of energy economics. He uses all of his movements in an efficient manner. He's not one of those bears you're going to see running downstream, charging after salmon. Really doesn't even seem, no matter his hunger level, he really does seem to be patient enough and know that he can wait for fish to come to him. And he's really not in a good fishing position right now. He seems to be maybe waiting for access to the far pool, or maybe he's had a lot of meals earlier today and he's just kind of resting for the time being. He's a big guy overall, so when when you weigh as much as he does, maybe close to 800, 900 pounds or something like that, maybe even a little bit more, you're unlikely to get cold in the water. So he can sit in the water and be quite comfortable and really not burn any extra calories versus what he would burn resting on the land. And then he's that much closer to the food sources that he wants if he happens to get hungry.
Yeah, I've seen several bears resting in the water this week because it has been so warm. And imagine being Otis's size with that size belly and wearing a fur coat when it's 75 degrees out. Being in the water must feel really good.
And another example of that downstream, Naomi, we'll go back to the river watch for just a moment, of a bear, kind of doing just that in the lower river area. So just lounging in the water, looking for salmon casually, sticking its face in the water there, but not really doing any serious fishing. So just kind of enjoying the environment right now and the conditions that's available to it. Bears, those adult males, they can overheat quite quickly when they're being active. So a younger bear, since it has a greater amount of surface area compared to its overall volume, they cool down easier, so they can get rid of their body heat a little bit easier than the big adult males. Big adult males like Otis, though, he is if he really was to expend a lot of energy by running, he would get overheated quite quickly. So for him, it's probably just great to sit in the water.
And it's interesting, we see Otis pretty consistently throughout the season. Trying to think, I think last August, maybe early September, Otis did leave for a while to go to one of the smaller streams or rivers around here where it's pretty easy to find salmon this time of year.
Yeah, he's definitely changed his habits this year. It's not typical for Otis to hang out at Brooks River throughout the entire month of August, but the availability of salmon gave him that opportunity, and he just decided, why should I walk away when I can just make my living here? It could be a long trek for him to another place where he knows he can find salmon at this time of the year. So he's decided to stay. And last year we did have bears fishing at Brooks Falls basically every day from late June until the middle of October. And I think we're well positioned to see that same phenomenon in level of activity this year. Otis, even though he is an older bear, I mean, he still possesses the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. We see that when he's faced with different competitors coming down to the river and maybe taking his preferred fishing spots. And maybe we're seeing that this year with his his ability to reason and say, hey, there's food right here. There's no need for me to go to those other locations.
And he certainly is successful this year. He's quite big. You can't tell right now because his belly is in the water, but when he's standing behind that rock on the far side, which many of you call the conveyor belt, you can really see he's been very successful at fishing this year.
Each one of the bears that are at the falls right now are quite healthy for this time of the year. And frankly, if you saw a bear like this, like any of these in October, you'd be like, yeah, that bear's probably going to do okay throughout the winter. So they're very well fed for this time of the year. Now, Naomi, we see a different bear in the lip. We saw him earlier in the broadcast playing, but we didn't see him on the lip this year. But this is one of 8 2-1s on top of the waterfall. That's one of his sort of signature behavioral characteristics that helps me identify him when he's fishing the lip, just sitting down like that.
Right, because not all bears will sit. They'll stand and posture on the lip.
So like we were mentioning with 8-1-2, again, who's the bear in the jacuzzi, just outside of the jacuzzi right now, eating a salmon. They have their own behavioral characteristic that help
Is
them
that a
or that help us to identify them. Go ahead, Naomi.
Mike? Is that a salmon or a stick?
Oh, I couldn't tell. My view of this of him was actually quite small. So it could
I
be
think he was
could have
playing.
been a something, yeah, non-edible.
That's something we've seen a lot this year too. I mean, bears are very smart, very playful, and we've seen them play with each other, and they like to play with inanimate objects as well. And there's one yearling who's been doing a lot of that, who's broken into a couple of cars here. They're
Yeah, you told
curious.
me that earlier today, and I was actually quite surprised to hear that because I hadn't really read about that sort of thing happening at Brooks River in the past. But it really only takes one time for a bear to learn that something's neat and they want to investigate it further. And it doesn't have to necessarily be associated with the reward of food. It could just be a play reward. And when I was a ranger at Brooks Camp and I gave people orientations, I always tried to emphasize that we don't want to give bears any opportunity to learn that we have fun things to play with, and it's quite tempting for them, for bears, to play with our objects if we give them that opportunity. So we always try to avoid giving them that temptation.
Around here, people don't lock their cars. It's not like New York City, but I think the rest of the year, people are going to be locking the cars around here.
And these bears in Katmai, it's fortunate, and it's the fact that they don't associate people with food really does underscore the success of not only the National Park Service over the last 40 years to really try to make sure that bears never have the opportunity to gain access to food, but also the buy-in from the public as well. When people come to Brooks River, they're given a mandatory orientation, so the rules and regulations are laid out, and I think everyone who comes to Brooks River really sort of understands that it's important to follow and abide by those rules and guidelines to protect the overall experience. With 812 probably has never had the opportunity to experience human food before. And that's not the case with bears and a lot of other ecosystems and a lot of other national parks. If you go to Sequoia National Park, for instance, you can't even keep any food in your car at all because bears have learned that they're to target cars and go looking at each and every car in a parking lot because they've discovered food within it. So we can coexist with bears, certainly, if we make sure that bears are just doing bear things without the extra temptation to destroy our objects or associate us with food.
Look at the difference in size between those two, and I'm assuming that 812 behind 821.
Yeah, I think so. Big difference in size when you see them like this. They're not really. They're still a few yards apart on the camera. From this angle, it looks like they're standing just shoulder to shoulder, but they have some space separating them. But definitely a sizable or a noticeable difference in size between that I think illustrates what can happen when there's just a couple years difference or even a year difference between being born, and also genetic differences as well. Some bears are probably just predisposed to grow faster than other bears.
And 812's doing a little bit of a recognizable behavior for him, which is reaching his paw out when he's on the lip. Again, that helps me a lot in recognizing bears. I'm always looking for behaviors that seem familiar to me.
Yeah, watch for 821, again, the bear on closest to us in the view right now, to sit down. Look for 812 who's behind him to sort of reach out his paw from time to time. He's not the only bear that does this, but he does do it frequently. So again, you're trying to narrow down who's who. And this is a photo of him from a couple of years ago. So he's grown quite a bit since then, but he still has a little bit of a tendency to reach out with his paw periodically when he's fishing the lip. And then he'll also go right back to those rocks where the other bear is walking right now to eat his catch. I'm going to take a look downstream, Naomi, because we're still looking at this same bear. This is appears to be a young bear. I'm not able to identify it from what we can see on the camera right now, but just again relaxing in the water right now. But I wanted to go down here because gives us this view from the camera operators are giving us right now. It just gives us a great opportunity to look at some of those finer details of a bear's fur and how they manipulate objects. We were just talking about a bear potentially playing with a stick, and this one's kind of doing the same thing
in a very lazy way.
Yeah, just laying prone on the stomach here. So this bear is feeling relaxed, comfortable, finding strange and novel things in its environment. Maybe that's all. Maybe the only thing that has to be is just a stick that floats down right to it. You can see a little bit of maybe some grizzled fur on this bear right now. And brown bears are the same species as grizzly bears. So the difference between the two is really just kind of local preference and based on geography. Typically, the common name brown bear is applied to bears that live in coastal areas of Alaska and British Columbia, while grizzlies live farther inland. There's really no genetic evidence to separate the two out based on that geographic divide. And they can freely interbreed with one another. So there's the same species as one another. But yeah, brown bears will still have those, sometimes those light-tipped fur or that grizzled fur. Same thing that you would see in a grizzly bear in Yellowstone.
So this bear just being kind of sleepy and lazy in the river is kind of typical for this time of day when it's actually the warmest here. Yesterday afternoon, a little later, I was on the bridge and there was a bear sleeping under the walkway to the bridge. And I know, Mike, you had a lot of experience of bears doing that when you had the floating bridge and they would sleep under the lower river platform.
Yeah, or right on the trail that people used to access the bridge. So bears, will use, of course, the river, but they'll use the near vicinity as well. They'll use the banks, they'll use the trails. There's no bear-free spot at Brooks River. So if you do plan to visit anytime in the future, keep that in mind. The only really bear-free spot that you can be sure of is inside of a building. Everywhere else is bear territory.
Well, and this year we've also seen some bears breaking windows. So it's not completely bear free in a building. One bear management people told me they thought maybe that the bear was seeing its reflection in the window, and we don't know if it recognizes itself. Mike, do you know of any studies about that?
No, I've never, or at least I can't recall anyone trying to do the mirror test with brown bears. It may have happened. I just can't recall. And sometimes, especially in the past, scientists thought, well, if an animal can recognize itself in a mirror, that means it's self-aware. But there's probably other ways that bears can express their intelligence and awareness. So we don't really know if bears are self-aware, but we know that they are very, very smart animals, perhaps equivalent in intelligence to our domestic dogs.
Oh yeah, we see that all the time. They are very smart.
And now, Naomi, we do have, in this view right now, a bear, and then you can see several people standing in the background. As a ranger, can you explain a little bit about the rules associated with people in the river?
Yeah. Well, in the river or on the ground, one is supposed to maintain at least 50 yards from a bear, more than 50 yards if it's a sow with cubs. These people look like they're trying to do that. They're not moving into the river. And if you're fishing in the river, and it looks like there's a bear that's going to be within 50 yards, you need to cut your line, because again, we don't want bears to associate people with food. Now, are we seeing that bear diving now, Mike?
Yeah, it has been going underneath. We've been seeing a lot of bears, or not a lot, but we've seen several bears diving right in the spot here. So this might be a deeper spot where there's salmon collecting right at the bottom. So
I
not
love
an
seeing
uncommon
them.
fishing technique.
Yeah. Of course, the
Going
other
back to
day I
your,
was.
your.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I saw a bear diving in the jacuzzi last week. But we can watch this bear. And you had a question, Mike?
Well, I was just going to go back to your thought and information that you provided about people at Brooks River. Certainly people are an important part of this landscape. People have occupied this area for nearly continuously for the last 5,000 years or so. Our relationship with bears has changed over time. So we're looking at them as a resource and as a tourist resource, which is something that any Alaska Native groups that using this area would have looked at them in a different manner, a different manner. When we go to Brooks River, though, it's really important to consider how we can reduce our impact on the animals. So that means, I think, primarily, like you said, Naomi, giving them space, making sure that you're giving them at least 50 yards of space. But just like, driving on a highway when the roads are icy, you don't always drive the speed limit. A lot of times you have to slow down. So at Brooks River, there's often a lot of situations where you need to give bears just a little bit of extra room, depending on their behavior and their needs. So I'm always erring on the side of caution. And sticking to the wildlife viewing platforms is also really a wonderful way to reduce your impact on the animals. Because bears can learn that, hey, if the people are predictable up in these locations, they're not down in the water where necessarily I need to walk or access fish. So it's much easier for bears to sort of habituate to our presence in those situations versus being in the water. But this bear right here, Naomi, was successful in its attempt to locate a salmon in that channel upstream of the camera here.
Yeah. I love watching them dive because it's not something we see very often, and I wonder where and how this bear learned to dive.
That's always an interesting question. Sometimes people will ask, hey, do bears learn only from their mother? Like, did their mother dive or what? What is it? And I think often it is that is the case, that a mother uses a certain fishing technique and its cubs learn to do that as well. And they'll apply that when they become independent. But bears also possess the capacity to learn from one another by watching one another, because there's not a lot of mother bears that will take their cubs into the jacuzzi, for instance. Although we still occasionally will see a couple of females fishing the jacuzzi, but most of the time it's the domain of adult males, and they don't play any role in raising their in raising offspring. So bears can really certainly put two and two together, and it speaks again to their level of intelligence, and they can see other bears doing certain things and apply those techniques to their own lives.
Now we see Otis
And a
out
few
of the
minutes left
water.
on Well, a few minutes left in our broadcast, Naomi, and looking at a couple of giants here. I think actually Otis is still downstream of these two bears. I think from my view, I can see number 32 against the far wall there, and then number 747 walking upstream. And you can see 32 there, just a little uncomfortable with 747, deciding, hey, that bigger bear, that more dominant bear who's given me trouble in the past, displaced me in the past, is just not worth me trying to stand my ground. Even if 747 doesn't want that spot, I'm just not comfortable with.
Yeah. Now, 747 is a giant.
He is really a monster bear, and monster in the sense of just super big. He's not really particularly more aggressive than any other bear. He's a very dominant bear based on his size, but he's not as aggressive or as assertive as number 856, who we haven't seen this evening. But 856 is also a very large, assertive bear and more dominant than 747. But yeah, 747 is just a true giant among bears. You really, I say this frequently with our web, if you're a frequent watcher of the webcams, you probably heard me say this often, but you should be thankful to see a bear as big as 747. They do not get as big that often.
No, it's interesting. His behavior has been a little less tolerant in the last couple of weeks when there've been fewer salmon, right? So it's a little more competitive. He's been more possessive of his fishing holes, and has eyed a couple of bears to make sure that they don't come near him. And I think we're seeing some of that now, maybe.
Yeah, 747. Kind of just getting in the face of Otis there. Otis isn't for a fishing spot, so 747 probably is just doing this to reaffirm his dominance over 747. Just going there to remind him, hey, you remember me, I remember you, and you should remember what I'm capable of. So just approaching him like that. Otis, yawning a little bit. We can't hear him growling, but he may have given a little bit of a bellow there as well. And then in the background, right behind them, you can see Chunk. He moved out of the far pool as 747 approached to avoid him. And now he's just sitting downstream, probably just hoping that 747 doesn't try to come over and interact with him.
And again, this shows us how much that happens in the river is related to the salmon, because they wouldn't. 747 didn't have to do this a month ago because there were so many salmon. But right now there are fewer salmon, so he is defending his turf more.
And this, he's reaffirmed when he reaffirms his dominance. What we'll see happen here, just to back up a little bit with my thoughts, is we'll see 747 turn and walk away. The other bears will sit there and watch him. So generally, when you're looking at two bears interacting, unless the more dominant bear, wants a particular resource, like a fishing spot, for instance, it's going to be the more dominant bear that walks away from an interaction. So since these bears, they're not really good fishing spots where these bears are right now. What we'll see when 747 is satisfied that the other bears are going to yield, he'll 747 will turn his back and walk away. So that's something that you can predictably expect to happen with a more dominant bear in these situations. Again, unless it's over a fishing spot, and then in those situations, the subordinate bear will yield his spot, and the more dominant bear will move in.
I don't know, this makes me laugh. It looks like three old men facing off with each other.
Yeah, Chunk and Otis downstream again, just waiting for 747 to move away. 747, he has so much body fat on him right now. Again, he's well positioned to survive winter hibernation. He came back this year with a lot of fat reserves from last year. So he doesn't have to necessarily spend every waking moment in the search for food. So all of these bears, like we talked about before, are well positioned to survive winter hibernation already.
And 747 is another patient bear. We always talk about Otis's patience, but we've seen 747 sit in the jacuzzi for hours. And it may not seem like he gets a lot of fish, but that patience pays off.
Right, a bear, an adult male only needs like a couple fish per day to meet his basal metabolic rate. So his basic metabolic rate, his minimum energy needs per day, he can meet that easily with 2 whole salmon. So if he's sitting there in the water and he only catches 2 salmon per hour, he's still doing really good in the scheme of things. Just a couple minutes left in our broadcast, Naomi. I think it's been a night where we've seen a few different bears doing a few different things. We're seeing conditions on the river changing. Certainly less salmon available to the bears right now than we saw earlier in the run with the mass migration and the hundreds of thousands of fish moving into Brooks River. But I think we're going to start to continue to see some things shifting on the river as salmon begin to spawn and die. But one thing that I do predict that we'll see throughout the rest of the summer is certainly bears at the falls and at the riffles, the lower river, continuing to fish.
Yeah, and I always say, I mean, if you do come to Brooks, the riffles is really quite a wonderful view. I think it's a much underrated platform to watch the bears.
For sure. This is the view from the Riffles platform right now. You can see a lot of the big giants up at Brooks Falls, so it's worth spending some time there. The Riffles gives you the opportunity to see maybe younger bears or different bears using the area. So it's worthwhile to spend your time in all of these different locations to see more of the whole suite of bears, the whole sleuth, I guess, or sloth. If you were talking about a group of bears, it's called a sleuth or a sloth. You can get a good idea of that by visiting these different locations at the river. And then, when you're watching at home, you have just an amazing opportunity to do this just by switching between the different webcams. So your experience at home is actually quite I think, a rich wildlife viewing experience because of these different camera angles and the wonderful views that the camera operators are giving us once again. So it's certainly progressing towards a season of change at Brooks River as the salmon begin to spawn and bears make their final preparations for hibernation. But it's been great to talk to you this evening, Naomi, and I always enjoy speaking with you about bears.
Oh, it's a lot of fun, and they provided us with a lot of entertainment this afternoon or this evening for you.
Yeah, thanks again, Naomi. If you want to join us again, our next live event will be tomorrow from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We won't be on camera, but we'll be in the comments at the bottom of the page on the Brooks live chat channel. So Naomi and I will be there answering your questions. Actually, excuse me, that'll be on the main Brooks Falls channel on Explored.org tomorrow. And then we also have another play-by-play broadcast set up on Wednesday. It'll be earlier in the day. I forget the time, but please check the featured comment at the bottom of the page. It'll have the correct time in there. Again, Naomi Boak from Katmai National Park joined me today to talk about bears and salmon. My name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explored.org. Please join us again for our other Bear Camp broadcasts. And please stay well during these challenging times. We'll talk to you later.